October 12, 1964. Pitsunda, Georgian SSR. Nikita Khrushchev stood on the balcony of his dacha, watching black sea waves crash against the rocky shore. At 70 years old, the first secretary of the Communist Party felt he'd earned this vacation. Behind him, through open windows, came the sound of his grandchildren's laughter mixing with Georgian folk music on the radio. The October sun warmed his face as he sipped Georgian wine, contemplating his next agricultural reforms. The phone rang inside. His bodyguard answered, then appeared at the balcony door with an unusual expression, something between deference and pity. "Comrade, First Secretary, Moscow is calling. The Presidium requests your immediate return for an urgent session." Khrushchev waved dismissively. "Tell them it can wait until Monday. I'm on vacation." The bodyguard hesitated. "They were insistent, Comrade Secretary." What Khrushchev didn't know, what he couldn't know as he stood there in his summer shirt, annoyed at the interruption of his rest, was that 870 miles to the north, in a secret meeting room in the Kremlin, 15 men he'd appointed to power were voting to end his rule. His own protege, his hand-picked loyalists, the generals and party secretaries he'd elevated over a decade, were now meticulously orchestrating his political execution. The phone call wasn't a request. It was a summons to his own trial. And the vacation he thought he'd earned would be the last hours of freedom for the man who had denounced Stalin, gambled on Cuba, and shocked the world with his shoe at the United Nations. He was being overthrown, and he was the only person in the Soviet Union who didn't know it yet. For Nikita Khrushchev in October 1964, the idea that his position was vulnerable seemed absurd. He had survived Stalin's purges. He had outmaneuvered Malenkov and crushed the anti-party group in 1957. He had consolidated power through a combination of political acumen, populist appeal, and ruthless elimination of rivals. When Georgy Malenkov, Vyacheslav Molotov, and Lazar Kaganovich tried to remove him 7 years earlier, Khrushchev had turned the tables, expelled them from power, and emerged stronger than ever. "I am the party," Khrushchev reportedly told aides in 1963, a statement that would have seemed megalomaniacal if it weren't largely true. He held both the position of First Secretary of the Communist Party and Chairman of the Council of Ministers, a concentration of power Stalin himself had maintained. His famous 1956 secret speech denouncing Stalin's crimes had positioned him as a reformer, a man bold enough to challenge the cult of personality while building his own. Western intelligence assessments in 1964 considered Khrushchev's position secure. A CIA analysis from September 1964 noted, "Khrushchev has weathered numerous political storms and consistently demonstrated an ability to outmaneuver opponents. His control of party apparatus appears complete." The conventional wisdom in Washington, London, and other Western capitals was that Khrushchev would remain in power until death or voluntary retirement. The Soviet system, they believed, didn't allow for peaceful transitions of power. Soviet citizens saw Khrushchev as larger than life, literally and figuratively. His round physique, expressive face, and habit of interrupting speeches with colorful folk sayings made him seem almost folksy compared to Stalin's icy remoteness. When he pounded his shoe on a desk at the United Nations in 1960, shouting at a Filipino delegate, it shocked diplomats, but amused many Russians who saw it as peasant authenticity breaking through diplomatic pretense. But within the Kremlin's inner circles, a different perception had been growing for months. Leonid Brezhnev, whom Khrushchev had promoted to president of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet, privately complained to other Presidium members about Comrade Khrushchev's impulsive decisions. KGB chairman Vladimir Semishastny, another Khrushchev protege, began documenting what he termed irregularities in decision-making processes. Marshal Rodion Malinovsky, the defense minister, grew increasingly frustrated with what he saw as military policy determined by political whim rather than strategic necessity. After Khrushchev's disastrous 1962 Caribbean gamble, the Cuban Missile Crisis that brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, military leaders privately questioned his judgment. "He plays chess with nuclear weapons," one general reportedly said, "but he doesn't know the rules." Mikhail Suslov, the party's chief ideologist, had catalogued each deviation from orthodox Marxist-Leninist doctrine. Khrushchev's agricultural experiments, his reorganization of party structures, his embrace of peaceful coexistence with capitalism. All of it troubled the conservative elements within the party apparatus. And these weren't marginal figures complaining over vodka in private apartments. These were the most powerful men in the Soviet Union. What made October 1964 different from previous challenges to Khrushchev's authority was coordination. In 1957, his opponents had moved against him openly, giving him time to rally supporters and turn the Central Committee against them. This time, the conspiracy was airtight. As Alexander Shelepin, the former KGB chairman now heading the party's State Control Committee, later explained, "We learned from the anti-party group's mistake. You don't wound the bear, you kill it in one strike." The conspirators believed they were saving the Soviet Union from what Brezhnev would later describe in the formal charges as harebrained schemes, hasty decisions, bragging and bluster, attraction to rule by fiat, and unwillingness to take into account the achievements of science and practical experience. But their public justifications masked more personal motivations: wounded pride, thwarted ambitions, and simple fear that Khrushchev's unpredictability might drag them all down. The seeds of Khrushchev's downfall were planted in the very reforms that had brought him to power. His 1956 secret speech to the 20th Party Congress, a 4-hour denunciation of Stalin's crimes delivered to stunned delegates, had been a calculated risk that paid off politically. By condemning the cult of personality, Khrushchev had differentiated himself from Stalin's henchmen while conveniently omitting his own role in the terror. But de-Stalinization created instability. In Hungary later that year, anti-Soviet uprising killed thousands when Khrushchev ordered tanks into Budapest. Conservative party members blamed his speech for emboldening counter-revolutionaries. Suslov, even then the ideological guardian, had opposed the speech from the start, arguing it would undermine the foundations of party authority. Khrushchev's response to criticism was typically bold. He doubled down. Between 1957 and 1964, he launched a dizzying array of reforms that destabilized the very bureaucracy that sustained Soviet power. He divided regional party organizations into industrial and agricultural sectors, creating administrative chaos and threatening the traditional power base of provincial party secretaries. He rotated officials constantly, making long-term fiefdom building impossible, but also creating a class of displaced, resentful former officials. The economic schemes bordered on fantasy. The Virgin Lands campaign, plowing up millions of acres of Siberian and Kazakh steppe, initially produced impressive harvests, but led to catastrophic soil erosion. "We will bury you in grain," Khrushchev boasted to Western diplomats. But by 1963, the Soviet Union was importing American wheat. His promise that the USSR would overtake U.S. meat and dairy production led to the disastrous decision to plant corn in climates where it couldn't grow. Soviet citizens began calling it Khrushchev's corn. "Communism will be built by 1980, Khrushchev declared in the revised party program of 1961, setting a specific deadline that made future failure measurable. It was the kind of grandiose promise that thrilled rank-and-file party members but horrified pragmatic administrators who understood the economic impossibility. His foreign policy swung wildly between peaceful coexistence and nuclear brinkmanship. The Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962 was both his greatest gamble and his most serious failure. Installing nuclear missiles in Cuba was supposed to be a clever strategic move, leveraging Soviet support for Castro's revolution while achieving nuclear parity with the United States. Now they'll know what it feels like to have enemy missiles on their doorstep, he told the Presidium, referring to American Jupiter missiles in Turkey. But President Kennedy's naval blockade forced a humiliating retreat. Khrushchev withdrew the missiles in exchange for a secret promise that American missiles would leave Turkey, a diplomatic victory he couldn't publicize. To the Soviet military and the Presidium, it looked like capitulation. Marshal Malinovsky was furious, telling colleagues, "We moved the missiles in like thieves in the night, and we removed them like thieves in the morning." The conspiracy against Khrushchev began to take concrete form in early 1964. The initial conversations were indirect, testing loyalties through careful language. Brezhnev, as president, had the most access to other Presidium members. His approach was methodical, individual conversations, expressions of concern rather than direct recruitment. "Comrade Khrushchev seems tired," he would say. "Perhaps he's taken on too much responsibility." Shelepin, younger and more aggressive, wanted faster action. At 46, he represented a new generation of Soviet leaders, men who had come of age after the revolution, who had missed the terror's worst years, who saw Khrushchev's generation as obsolete. He coordinated with Semikosny at the KGB to ensure the security apparatus would remain neutral, or better yet, supportive, during the coup. The critical recruit was Suslov. As the party's chief ideologist, his participation would provide legitimacy. Suslov had opposed Khrushchev's policies for years, but had always stopped short of active opposition. In March 1964, Brezhnev and Shelepin approached him carefully. They didn't ask him to join a conspiracy. They asked him to help restore collective leadership and correct violations of Leninist norms. Suslov's agreement was the turning point. With his support, the conspiracy could claim it was defending party principles rather than pursuing personal ambition. Through the summer of 1964, the conspirators expanded their network. They recruited Nikolai Podgorny, Alexei Kosygin, and other Presidium members. They coordinated with Central Committee secretaries and obtained assurances from military commanders that the army would not intervene to save Khrushchev. The planning was meticulous. They chose October because Khrushchev would be on vacation, away from Moscow and his loyalists. They prepared formal charges, a bill of particulars documenting every policy failure, every administrative reorganization, every slight to party dignity. They coordinated timing to ensure all conspirators would be in Moscow while Khrushchev was in Georgia. And they maintained absolute secrecy. Not a single word leaked to Khrushchev's personal staff, his security detail, or his family. As Semikosny later admitted, "We learned from Stalin's methods, even as we criticized them. The key to a successful purge, we called it political transition, was total surprise and overwhelming force." October 13th, 1964, 10 a.m. Moscow time. The Presidium meeting began without its chairman. Leonid Brezhnev sat in Khrushchev's usual seat at the head of the long table in the Kremlin's ornate meeting room. 14 other men filed in: Kosygin, Podgorny, Suslov, Shelepin, Semikosny, Malinovsky, and others. Some looked nervous. Others wore expressions of grim determination. No one spoke as they took their seats. Brezhnev opened with careful formality. "Comrades, we are here to discuss serious violations of collective leadership and party norms by Comrade Khrushchev. The issues we address today concern the very survival of our party and state." For 3 hours, they built their case. Suslov presented the ideological charges: deviation from Marxist-Leninist principles, personality cult, arbitrary decision-making. Shelepin detailed administrative chaos, the division of party organizations, constant restructuring, demoralization of cadres. Kosygin, who would soon replace Khrushchev as premier, outlined economic failures, agricultural disasters, unrealistic planning targets, the humiliation of grain imports. Marshal Malinovsky's testimony was devastating. The defense minister described how Khrushchev had slashed military budgets while pursuing adventurous foreign policies. He cut conventional forces by 1.2 million men while provoking crises. We lacked the conventional capability to win. He gambled in Cuba and then retreated, costing us credibility with our allies. He treats nuclear weapons like propaganda tools rather than instruments requiring the most careful strategic consideration. The formal vote came at 1 p.m. The question: does the Presidium support Comrade Khrushchev's continued leadership? 14 hands rose in opposition. Khrushchev's son-in-law, Alexei Ajubey, was not present. He'd been deliberately excluded from the meeting. Only one member, Anastas Mikoyan, abstained rather than voting against his old friend. Later, Mikoyan would say, "I couldn't raise my hand against him, but I couldn't save him either." The vote was predetermined. October 13th, 1964, 2 p.m. Georgian time, 12 p.m. Moscow time. In Pitsunda, Khrushchev remained oblivious. His security chief had told him Moscow wanted him back for a routine presidium session to discuss agricultural policy. Annoyed but compliant, Khrushchev agreed to return the following day. He spent the afternoon swimming in the Black Sea, enjoying what he believed was a minor interruption to his vacation. What he didn't know: his phone lines had been monitored since August. Every conversation was recorded, every visitor logged. Semichazny had ordered the KGB to track, but not impede Khrushchev's movements. The conspiracy wanted no hint of alarm that might trigger a counterattack. That evening, a more urgent call came through. This time, the message was blunt. The Presidium requires your presence tomorrow morning. All members will be present. The session is mandatory. The word mandatory was unusual. Khrushchev began to sense something wrong, but his options were limited. He was 870 miles from Moscow, surrounded by KGB security personnel who, unknown to him, now reported to Semichazny, not to him. October 14th, 1964, morning, Vnukovo Airport. Moscow. Khrushchev's plane landed at 10 a.m. Normally, a fleet of black ZIL limousines and a security detail would have met him. Instead, a single car waited. Semichazny himself stood on the tarmac. The KGB chairman, personally collecting the first secretary, was unprecedented and ominous. The drive to the Kremlin was silent. Khrushchev asked questions. Semichazny deflected. "The Presidium will explain everything, Comrade First Secretary." Years later, Semichazny recalled, "He knew by then. I could see it in his eyes. He'd been through Stalin's purges. He recognized the pattern. But there was nothing he could do. We controlled the security forces. We controlled access to the Central Committee. We controlled everything." October 14th, 1964, 11 a.m. Kremlin. Khrushchev entered the Presidium meeting room to find all 15 members already seated. That alone was abnormal. The first secretary always arrived first. Brezhnev sat in Khrushchev's chair. No one stood as he entered. "Comrade Khrushchev," Brezhnev began, reading from prepared notes. "The Presidium has met to discuss serious concerns regarding your leadership. We have documented numerous violations of collective leadership, administrative failures, and policy errors that have damaged the party and state. You will now hear these charges." For 6 hours, they dismantled his decade in power. Each member spoke in turn, presenting evidence and accusations. Suzlov's ideological critique was withering. "You have replaced Leninist principles with personal whim. You have elevated yourself above the party. creating a new cult of personality even as you claimed to oppose Stalin's cult. You speak of collective leadership while making decisions alone. Shelepin attacked his administrative reforms. You have created chaos in party organizations. Regional secretaries don't know who they report to. Industrial managers bypass party structures. You have weakened the very apparatus that sustains Soviet power. Kosygin detailed economic disasters. Agricultural production has fallen. Industrial growth has slowed. We import grain from capitalist countries, the same countries you promised to bury. Your corn campaign has become an international joke. Your promise of communism by 1980 is impossible, and every economist knows it. The military charges cut deepest. Malinovsky described the Cuban humiliation, the slashed conventional forces, the erratic nuclear saber rattling. You treat war like a political game. You installed missiles in Cuba without consulting military leadership about whether we could defend them. When Kennedy called your bluff, you retreated, and our allies lost faith in Soviet protection. China mocks us because of Cuba. Our own generals question whether you understand military reality. Khrushchev fought back. His famous temper erupted as he shouted responses, jabbed his finger at accusers, appealed to shared history. I saved you from Stalin. I ended the terror. I gave you the freedom to sit here and criticize me, something you could never have done before. To Brezhnev, I promoted you from nothing. You were a provincial nobody before I brought you to Moscow. To Suslov, you dare lecture me about ideology? You who served Stalin without question for decades? To Malinovsky, the military wanted nuclear war during Cuba. I saved the world from your madness. But his fury met cold silence. These were not spontaneous complaints. This was a coordinated political execution. As each hour passed, Khrushchev's position became clearer. He had no allies in the room. The men he'd promoted, the colleagues he'd trusted, the party he'd led, all had turned against him. At one point, Mikoyan tried to soften the proceedings, suggesting that Khrushchev's contributions to defeating Nazism and ending Stalinism deserved recognition. Suslov shut him down immediately. We are not here to write history. We are here to correct mistakes before they destroy us. October 14th, 1964. Evening. The formal vote came after 5 p.m. The question to Khrushchev: will you resign voluntarily or require a Central Committee plenum? It was a strategic choice. If Khrushchev refused to resign, the conspirators would convene the Central Committee, where they'd already secured majority support, and remove him by vote. But that would take days and risk public exposure of the coup. Khrushchev understood the calculation. He could fight, force them to go through formal procedures, perhaps rally some supporters. But to what end? He was 70 years old. They controlled the security apparatus, the party machinery, the military. A public battle would either fail or trigger the kind of violent purge he'd spent years trying to end. I am old and tired, he finally said, his voice stripped of its usual bombast. Perhaps I have made mistakes. If the Presidium and Central Committee believe new leadership is needed, I will not stand in the way. It wasn't quite a resignation. It was an acknowledgement of defeat. The Presidium vote was unanimous. Khrushchev would be removed from all positions. Brezhnev would become first secretary. Kosygin would become premier. The formal announcement would describe it as Khrushchev's voluntary retirement due to advanced age and deteriorating health. As Khrushchev left the room that evening, Mikoyan embraced him. I'm sorry, Nikita Sergeyevich. They would have removed you with or without me. Khrushchev reportedly replied, I know, Anastas. Stalin would have shot them all. I gave them the freedom to remove me. Perhaps that's my greatest achievement. The immediate aftermath. The coup's success depended on preventing any counteraction. Within hours of Khrushchev's capitulation, the conspirators moved to secure their victory. All military commanders received direct communications from Defense Minister Malinovsky confirming the peaceful leadership transition and emphasizing that the armed forces supported the Presidium's decision. KGB stations across the Soviet Union and abroad got similar instructions from Semechazny. Normal operations would continue under new political leadership. The October 15, 1964 edition of Pravda announced the change with bureaucratic blandness. The Central Committee Plenum has granted N.S. Khrushchev's request to be relieved of his duties as First Secretary of the Central Committee, member of the Presidium, and Chairman of the Council of Ministers, in view of his advanced age and deterioration of his health. The accompanying editorial praised the wisdom of collective leadership, without mentioning Khrushchev's name again. Soviet citizens woke up to find their leader had vanished overnight. No photographs, no farewell address, no explanation beyond the cryptic health announcement. It was eerily reminiscent of Stalin-era disappearances, though without the arrests or executions. Muscovites rushed to newsstands, reading and rereading the brief announcement, trying to understand what it meant. Had there been a coup? Was Khrushchev sick? Would there be purges? Khrushchev himself was driven to his dacha in Petrovo-Dalny, about 25 miles from Moscow. KGB guards remained, but now they watched him rather than protected him. His phone line was cut. His access to government communications ended immediately. For a man who had run the Soviet Union for over a decade, the isolation was jarring. His son Sergei later recalled. He kept expecting someone to call, to explain what would happen next. No one called. Western reactions and intelligence failures. The coup caught Western intelligence completely by surprise. CIA Soviet analysts had noted no unusual activity in Moscow. No hints from agents, no signals traffic anomalies, no leadership tensions visible to outside observers. The overnight removal of a superpower leader revealed massive intelligence blind spots. We knew more about Soviet missile deployments than Soviet political dynamics, one CIA analyst admitted in a classified post-mortem. The assumption had been that Soviet leadership succession would follow either the Stalin model, death, or violent purge. A peaceful, coordinated coup executed by lieutenants against their patron was unprecedented in Soviet history. President Lyndon Johnson learned of Khrushchev's removal while campaigning in New York. His first reaction, caught on tape: "I don't know who these new fellows are or what they'll do." The timing was particularly awkward. Johnson was weeks away from an election against Barry Goldwater, whose campaign warned about Soviet aggression. Was the coup a sign of Kremlin instability or consolidation? The Kennedy assassination 1 year earlier loomed over American reactions. Both superpowers had now experienced sudden, shocking leadership changes. American officials worried whether the new Soviet leadership would honor existing agreements. The partial test ban treaty, the direct hotline between Washington and Moscow, tacit understandings about proxy conflicts. British intelligence assessments were more analytical. MI6 Soviet specialists had noted Khrushchev's growing isolation, but hadn't predicted coordinated action. A Foreign Office memo from October 16, 1964, observed, "The change demonstrates that Soviet political culture has evolved beyond Stalinist murder, but remains fundamentally authoritarian. Khrushchev's reformism died with his removal. Expect conservative retrenchment." The Brezhnev system takes shape. The new leadership, dubbed the Troika of Brezhnev, Kosygin, and Podgorny, immediately emphasized collective decision-making. This was partly genuine. None wanted to repeat Khrushchev's concentration of power, and partly strategic cover for what was actually happening. Brezhnev's methodical consolidation of authority. Brezhnev moved carefully. Unlike Khrushchev's dramatic reforms, Brezhnev pursued stability through patronage. He promoted loyalists slowly, rewarded institutional constituencies, military, KGB, regional party secretaries, and avoided dramatic policy shifts. As he told the Presidium in November 1964, "We don't need new campaigns. We need competent administration." The Khrushchevisms, administrative reorganizations, agricultural experiments, ideological campaigns, were systematically dismantled. Regional party organizations were reunified. The rotation policy that had kept officials insecure ended, allowing the development of stable power bases. Industrial and agricultural ministries were restored to traditional structures. The chaos ended, replaced by the stagnation that would define the Brezhnev era. Kosygin, as premier, focused on economic reform. His 1965 initiatives attempted to introduce market-like mechanisms into Soviet planning, profit indicators for enterprises, decentralized decision-making, material incentives. These reforms showed promise initially, but were gradually smothered by party conservatives and bureaucratic resistance. By 1968, they'd been effectively abandoned. The unspoken agreement among the leadership was no more adventures. Cuba had terrified them all. Khrushchev's nuclear brinkmanship, his impulsive threats, his combination of bellicosity and cowardice, all were rejected. The new foreign policy emphasized predictability. Build up military capabilities quietly, avoid direct confrontation with the United States, maintain the socialist camp through force if necessary, Czechoslovakia, 1968, but without risking superpower war. The treatment of Khrushchev. What happened to the deposed leader revealed much about how the Soviet system had changed. Stalin would have had him shot. Brezhnev granted him a pension, a dacha, and security protection. Khrushchev's family wasn't persecuted. His son-in-law Adjubey lost his position as his Vestia editor, but wasn't imprisoned. This marked genuine evolution in Soviet political culture. But the treatment was still punishing. Khrushchev was erased from public life completely. His name vanished from newspapers, his speeches were removed from libraries, his photographs were airbrushed from historical records. When the Great Soviet Encyclopedia required updating, subscribers received replacement pages for the Khrushchev entry. Instructions advised gluing in new content about the Kara-Bogazgol Bay instead. For 7 years, Khrushchev lived in internal exile at his dacha. He was allowed to garden, read, and eventually dictate memoirs that were smuggled to the West. But he couldn't attend public events, speak with journalists, or have contact with current leaders. Guards monitored visitors. Phone lines remained cut. He was a living ghost, alive but officially non-existent. His occasional attempts to reassert relevance were pathetic and futile. He would show up uninvited at polling stations on election days, hoping cameras would capture him voting. Security would usher him away. He wrote letters to the Central Committee defending his record. They went unanswered. Western journalists who managed to reach him found a bitter, confused old man who couldn't understand how his protege had turned on him so completely. "They were nothing before me," he told an Italian journalist who sneaked past security in 1965. "Nothing. I made them, and they destroyed me. Not with bullets like Stalin would have. That would have been honest. They just erased me like I never existed." Long-term political evolution. The coup's success established a new pattern for Soviet succession. When Brezhnev died in 1982, Yuri Andropov succeeded through Politburo selection, not violent purge. When Andropov died in 1984, Konstantin Chernenko followed the same process. When Chernenko died in 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev emerged through political maneuvering within existing structures. Each succession was opaque, determined by behind-the-scenes negotiation among power centers, party apparatus, military, KGB, economic ministries. But each followed the precedent of 1964. Coordinated elite action, formal procedures, no violence. The Soviet Union never developed democratic succession, but it moved beyond Stalinist terror. The coup also revealed the limits of individual leadership in the Soviet system. Khrushchev had believed he was indispensable, that his personality and will drove policy. His removal demonstrated that the apparatus, the bureaucracy, the institutions, the collective leadership was stronger than any individual. This realization shaped Soviet politics for the system's remaining decades. Brezhnev learned the lesson too well. Rather than risk removal through innovation or reform, he pursued stability through stagnation. The economic decline, technological lag, and social ossification of the 1970s and early 1980s directly traced to the post-coup emphasis on institutional stability over individual initiative. The very collective leadership that removed Khrushchev became a brake on necessary change. October 14, 1964, 6:30 p.m., Kremlin. The moment Khrushchev agreed to step down marked the culmination of the first successful nonviolent coup in Soviet history. In that Kremlin meeting room, with 15 men watching him accept defeat, the nature of Soviet power fundamentally shifted. Stalin had died in office. Lenin had died in office. Every previous Soviet leader had held power until death or until physical incapacity forced removal. Khrushchev became the first to be politically executed by his own lieutenants and survive. The statistical reality of the coup was stark. It required the coordination of 15 Presidium members, the acquiescence of 175 Central Committee members, the neutrality of the entire KGB apparatus, and the support of key military commanders. Hundreds of people knew about the conspiracy, yet not a single person warned Khrushchev. This level of coordinated secrecy in a system where informants were everywhere demonstrated how isolated he'd become. For the Soviet military, the coup was vindication. Marshal Malinovsky, who would die just 3 years later, saw Khrushchev's removal as correcting the dangerous impulsiveness that had nearly triggered nuclear war. Defense spending immediately stabilized, then increased. The bare-brained schemes of radical force reductions ended. By 1970, the Soviet Union would achieve nuclear parity with the United States, a goal that required the steady military investment Khrushchev's erratic policies had undermined. For the KGB, Semechazny's role in orchestrating the coup elevated the security services to kingmaker status. Future Soviet leaders would understand. You couldn't rule without KGB support. This dynamic would ultimately contribute to the rise of former KGB officers like Yuri Andropov and, decades later, Vladimir Putin. For ordinary Soviet citizens, the coup's impact was contradictory. Khrushchev's removal ended the chaotic reforms that had disrupted lives, but also closed the brief window of liberalization he'd opened. The thaw, the period of relative cultural and intellectual freedom, froze over under Brezhnev. Dissident writers found themselves imprisoned again. Artists faced renewed censorship. The temporary hope that the Soviet system might evolve peacefully died with Khrushchev's removal. Andrei Sakharov, the physicist who would become the Soviet Union's most famous dissident, wrote in his memoirs, "October 1964 was when I realized the system was unreformable. They removed the one leader willing to challenge Stalin's legacy. After that, I knew change would only come from outside the party, not within it." The international ramifications, China's response revealed the coup's geopolitical significance. The Sino-Soviet split had begun during Khrushchev's leadership, driven partly by Mao Zedong's contempt for Khrushchev personally and for his peaceful coexistence with capitalism. Chinese propaganda had mocked Khrushchev as a revisionist betraying revolutionary principles. Yet Beijing initially hoped the new Soviet leadership might repair the relationship. Mao sent Zhou Enlai to Moscow in November 1964 for talks. The meetings failed. Brezhnev proved just as unwilling as Khrushchev to subordinate Soviet interests to Chinese demands, and the split widened further. By 1969, Soviet and Chinese troops would clash in border conflicts that nearly escalated to war. The coup convinced Mao that Soviet revisionism wasn't about Khrushchev personally, but about Soviet bureaucratic conservatism. This realization helped trigger the Cultural Revolution, Mao's catastrophic attempt to prevent Chinese Communist Party bureaucrats from following the Soviet model. The cost would be millions of lives. For Eastern European satellites, the coup signaled a return to stricter control. Khrushchev had tolerated limited autonomy, the Hungarian uprising notwithstanding, and even permitted some economic experimentation. The new leadership emphasized fraternal solidarity and proletarian internationalism, code words for Moscow dominance. When Czechoslovak reformers tried to create socialism with a human face in 1968, Soviet tanks crushed the Prague Spring, with Brezhnev declaring the doctrine that socialist states' sovereignty was limited by collective interests. Western observers initially hoped Brezhnev might be more reasonable than Khrushchev. The opposite proved true. Khrushchev's erratic behavior had created crisis, but also opportunities for negotiation. Brezhnev's methodical military buildup and ideological rigidity produced a more dangerous form of confrontation. Predictable, inexorable, and ultimately unsustainable. The arms race accelerated. Proxy wars intensified. Détente, when it came in the 1970s, was less a genuine relaxation than a temporary recognition of stalemate. The personal toll Khrushchev died on September 11, 1971, at age 77. Only family and a few friends attended the funeral. No state ceremony, no lying in state, no memorial in Red Square. He was buried in Novodevichy Cemetery, the traditional resting place for Soviet artists and intellectuals, not with Lenin and Stalin in the Kremlin wall. Even in death, he was separated from the leadership he'd once commanded. His memoirs, smuggled to the West and published in 1970, were bitter but revealing. He acknowledged mistakes, the forced corn cultivation, the shoe-pounding incident, the Cuban gamble, but defended his larger legacy. I ended the terror. I told the truth about Stalin. I tried to give people better lives. If that's why they removed me, so be it. At least I tried. For the conspirators, success brought power, but not happiness. Brezhnev would rule for 18 years, but the final years saw him physically and mentally declining while sycophants prevented any graceful transition. He died in 1982, having transformed the Soviet Union into a gerontocracy where innovation died and stagnation became policy. The system he stabilized would collapse less than a decade after his death. Suslov died in 1982, Kosygin in 1980, Shelepin was removed from power in 1975, seen as too ambitious. Semishasti lost the KGB chairmanship in 1960, sidelined by his own success in orchestrating the coup. No one trusted a security chief that effective. Mikoyan retired quietly in 1965, perhaps the only conspirator who seemed genuinely conflicted about betraying his old friend. The October 1964 coup established the pattern that would define Soviet politics until the system's collapse. It demonstrated that the Soviet Union could manage elite power transitions without mass violence, a significant evolution from Stalinism. But it also revealed the system's fundamental weakness. Any leader who tried to reform rather than maintain the status quo risked removal by the apparatus he commanded. Khrushchev's fate sent a clear message to future Soviet leaders. Innovation was dangerous, reform was risky, and survival required satisfying the bureaucracy, military, and security services, rather than pursuing visionary change. This dynamic directly contributed to the Soviet Union's decline. By the time Mikhail Gorbachev attempted serious reforms in the late 1980s, the system was too ossified to adapt. Glasnost and perestroika, efforts at controlled liberalization, instead triggered the collapse Gorbachev hoped to prevent. The coup also revealed the peculiar nature of authoritarian stability. Khrushchev was removed for the same qualities that made him an effective Cold War leader: boldness, willingness to challenge convention, readiness to take risks. His successors chose stability over dynamism, predictability over innovation. This satisfied institutional interests in the short term, but condemned the Soviet system to stagnation in the long term. For the Cold War's broader trajectory, Khrushchev's removal marked a subtle but significant shift. His combination of belligerence and flexibility, threatening capitalists while negotiating test ban treaties, had created a dynamic, unpredictable rivalry. The Brezhnev era brought methodical military buildup, proxy war escalation, and ideological rigidity that made the Cold War more stable in the short term, but ultimately more expensive and unsustainable for the Soviet economy. Modern Russia's political culture still echoes 1964. Vladimir Putin studied the Khrushchev coup carefully, understanding both how it succeeded and what it revealed about elite coordination against isolated leaders. His purges of potential rivals, his careful cultivation of security service loyalty, his emphasis on personal control over institutional structures, all reflect lessons learned from Khrushchev's fate. The fear of appearing weak, of making concessions that could be interpreted as retreat, of trusting subordinates. These anxieties shape Russian leadership to this day. The fundamental lesson of October 1964 was that in an authoritarian system, the worst sin isn't being wrong. It's making powerful people insecure. Khrushchev's reforms threatened too many interests: party bureaucrats whose positions he reorganized, military officers whose budgets he slashed, ideologues whose doctrines he revised, regional bosses whose power he undermined. He forgot that in the Soviet system, power flowed from institutions, not individuals. When the institutions united against him, his personality, his history, his previous victories, none of it mattered. As Nikita Khrushchev stood on that Black Sea balcony in October 1964, watching waves crash against the shore, convinced of his own indispensability, he was already politically dead. His own generals, his hand-picked successors, his trusted colleagues, they had already voted to erase him. The phone call summoning him back to Moscow wasn't an invitation to a meeting. It was a summons to his own funeral. The coup succeeded because no one came to save him. In a system he'd spent a decade leading, not a single person risked their career to warn him, defend him, or rally opposition to the conspiracy. That isolation, complete, absolute, and invisible until the very end, was his legacy's final irony. The man who ended Stalin's terror and tried to humanize Soviet communism was removed by the very human impulses he'd unleashed: ambition, resentment, and the eternal fear of becoming yesterday's man. He lived 7 more years, gardening at his dacha, dictating memoirs that would be published abroad but banned at home. When he died in 1971, the world barely noticed. The Soviet Union he'd led, shocked, reformed, and destabilized, had moved on without him. It was as if he'd never existed, which was exactly what his successors intended. They gave him what Stalin never would have: life after power. But they took something Stalin's victims at least received: memory. In the end, perhaps that was the cruelest punishment of all.